Natalie Brooks had exactly 3 good reasons for crashing this wedding, and approximately 17 terrible ones for staying. She smoothed down her emerald silk dress, borrowed from Harper's closet, and tried to blend into the sea of designer gowns that filled the Crystal Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom. At 26, she had mastered the art of being invisible in crowded rooms, a skill honed through years of observing rather than participating in life's grand celebrations. The chandeliers above cast golden light across marble floors that gleamed like mirrors. Natalie clutched her champagne glass, watching couples twirl across the dance floor with practiced elegance. Each laugh felt like a reminder that she was trespassing in a world where a single centerpiece probably cost more than her monthly rent for her tiny apartment above the art gallery where she worked. Harper had insisted she come, practically dragging her through the entrance with promises of adventure and excellent catering. Now Harper was somewhere near the seafood display, charming a group of lawyers, while Natalie sat alone at table 17, surrounded by empty chairs that seemed to emphasize her outsider status. She should leave. Call a rideshare. Escape back to her familiar world of oil paintings and quiet Saturday mornings. But something held her captive in that gilded chair. Perhaps it was the way the bride's face glowed when she looked at her groom, or how the elderly couple 2 tables over still reached for each other's hands between courses. Natalie found herself wondering if authentic love still existed, or if it had gone extinct like rotary phones and handwritten letters. Her grandmother Helen would have scolded her for such pessimism. Helen had raised Natalie after her parents passed away in a house fire when she was 12. The older woman had taught her that true love required courage, not just chemistry. Those Sunday afternoons spent in Helen's garden, hands dirty from planting roses, while wisdom flowed as naturally as conversation, remain Natalie's most treasured memories. The orchestra shifted to a slower melody, and Natalie's attention drifted across the crowded space. That moment changed everything. Julian Westbrook stood near the marble bar, his presence commanding without demanding. Natalie recognized him from business journals and society pages. The real estate developer who had transformed Chicago's skyline, known equally for his brilliant business strategies and his complete avoidance of serious relationships. His dark hair caught the light, and his custom tuxedo fit perfectly across his broad shoulders. Those steel blue eyes surveyed the room with calculated detachment, as if he were evaluating property rather than enjoying a celebration. Natalie watched several stunning women approach him throughout the evening. Each wore confidence like expensive perfume, their smiles practiced and purposeful. But Julian barely acknowledged them. His responses remained polite but distant, his attention already elsewhere before they finished their carefully rehearsed opening lines. Natalie looked away quickly, embarrassed to be caught staring. She belonged to a world of struggling artists and modest paychecks, of thrift store treasures and homemade meals. His universe involved penthouses and private planes, charity galas that raised millions, and decisions that shaped entire city blocks. The gap between them felt wider than Lake Michigan. Yet when she glanced up again, those piercing blue eyes were locked directly on her. Time suspended itself. The laughter and music faded into background noise as Julian's gaze held hers across the crowded ballroom. Natalie's heartbeat thundered in her ears, and warmth flooded her cheeks. She should look away, pretend she hadn't been watching him, but something in his expression kept her frozen. Curiosity mixed with something deeper, something almost hungry. Then Julian began moving toward her. Each step carried purpose and confidence, the crowd naturally parting around him. Natalie realized with equal parts terror and excitement that her quiet evening of observation was about to become something entirely different. Her fingers tightened around her champagne glass as he drew closer, his eyes never leaving hers. He stopped beside her table, and up close, he was even more striking. Fine lines creased the corners of his eyes, suggesting someone who smiled rarely but genuinely. A small scar marked his left eyebrow, an imperfection that somehow made him more human, more real. "May I join you?" His voice carried warmth beneath its polish, like expensive whiskey with unexpected heat. He gestured toward the empty chair, though both knew he was not actually requesting permission. "The seats are empty," Natalie replied, grateful her voice remained steady. "Though I should mention this table seems reserved for people who accidentally wandered into the wrong tax bracket." A genuine smile touched his lips as he sat down, and Natalie caught hints of his cologne, something subtle that reminded her of winter forests and old libraries. "Perhaps that makes it exactly where I need to be tonight." The answer surprised her completely. She had expected arrogance, the casual dismissal of someone accustomed to getting anything he desired. Instead, vulnerability flickered across his features, brief but unmistakable, as if he were testing unfamiliar words. "Natalie Brooks," she said, extending her hand with more confidence than she felt. "Before you ask, I am Harper's friend from the world where people actually check their bank balance before buying coffee. Julian Westbrook." His handshake was firm but brief, his palm warm against hers. "And that world sounds infinitely more interesting than mine." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the bride and groom move across the floor like they were floating. The bride's dress sparkled with thousands of crystals, and her new husband gazed at her as if she had personally arranged every star in the sky. Natalie found herself smiling at their obvious happiness, the kind that seemed to radiate from their very souls. "Do you believe in that?" Julian asked quietly, following her gaze. "In what exactly?" "Forever." The single word carried weight, as if he were testing its strength. The idea that two people can promise to love each other through everything life delivers and actually keep that promise. Natalie studied his profile, noting tension in his jaw and the way his fingers drummed silently against the white tablecloth. "You sound like someone who has given it serious thought." "I am 38 years old," he said, still watching the dancers. "I have developed properties across 3 states, employed thousands of people, and made decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars. But I have never once made a promise I was not completely certain I could keep." "That sounds incredibly lonely." "It sounds practical." But his voice carried hollowness, as if reciting a lesson learned but never truly believed. Natalie set down her champagne and turned to face him fully. "My grandmother Helen raised me after my parents died. She was married to my grandfather for 44 years before pneumonia took him. I used to ask her how she knew he was the one. Want to know what she told me?" Julian's eyes met hers, and she was struck by how intently he listened, as if her words might contain answers to questions he had been asking himself for years. She said she did not know at first. But every single day, she chose to love him. And every single day, he made the same choice back. The forever part was not a promise they made once. It was a promise they kept making, over and over. "And you believe that kind of daily devotion actually exists?" "I believe in the possibility," Natalie said carefully, "though I have never experienced it myself. I have seen enough failed relationships to know it requires more than just feelings." Something shifted in Julian's expression, a crack in his carefully maintained composure. "Would you dance with me?" The question caught her completely off guard. Around them, the reception continued its elegant rhythm, but suddenly it felt as if they existed in their own private bubble, separate from everyone else. Natalie glanced down at her borrowed dress, then at the designer gowns swirling past. "I do not really belong out there." "Neither do I," Julian said, standing and offering his hand. "Not tonight, anyway." Against every instinct screaming at her to be cautious, to protect herself, Natalie placed her hand in his. His fingers were warm and steady, and when he led her onto the dance floor, something inside her chest came alive. Something she had kept carefully locked away since her last relationship ended in disappointment. The music was soft and romantic, something classical that made the chandeliers seem to sway in rhythm. Julian's hand settled at the small of her back, respectful but firm, and Natalie found herself relaxing into his lead despite her nervousness. "You dance well," she murmured. "Expensive private school," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "Along with proper table manners and how to tie a bow tie correctly. Not exactly practical skills for most people." Most people do not need them. Exactly. His voice dropped lower. These kinds of nights usually mean nothing to me. The honesty made Natalie look up, and she found herself falling into those blue eyes. There was hunger there, but not the kind she expected. This was deeper, more complex, loneliness mixed with longing and something that might have been hope. They moved together perfectly, as if they had been dancing together for years instead of minutes. Other couples swirled around them, but Natalie barely noticed. All her focus centered on the way Julian looked at her, as if she were the only person in the room who mattered, the only one who was real. As the song began fading, Julian did not step away. Instead, he leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear, and whispered words that would shatter everything. "Be mine for just one night," some words strike like thunder on a clear day, unexpected and devastating. Natalie froze in Julian's arms, her body going rigid as his whispered request echoed through her mind. The ballroom continued spinning around them, guests laughing, glasses clinking, the orchestra playing their romantic melody. But for Natalie, everything had stopped cold. Be mine for just one night. She pulled back sharply, her brown eyes wide with shock and something that looked painfully like betrayal. The space between them suddenly felt like a canyon, impossible to cross. Her hands dropped from his shoulders as if his touch had burned her. "Excuse me?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of a shout. Julian's confident expression crumbled instantly, the polished mask slipping as he realized his words had landed like a slap instead of an invitation. His face paled, genuine panic flashing across his features. "Natalie, I did not mean it like that." "No." She stepped backward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Just no." Without another word, she turned and walked away, weaving through the dancing couples with urgent desperation. Her chest felt tight, breathing became difficult, and tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. How could she have been so foolish? How could she have thought someone like Julian Westbrook would see her as anything more than an easy target? She pushed through the ornate ballroom doors and found herself in the hotel's grand lobby. Fresh orchids filled crystal vases, their sweet scent almost suffocating. A few guests lingered near the elevators, their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings, but Natalie barely registered their presence. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to put as much distance as possible between herself and Julian's casual proposition. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, scrolling to Harper's contact. But before she could call, a warm hand touched her shoulder gently. "Natalie, please. Let me explain." She spun around to find Julian standing there, his perfectly styled hair now slightly mussed, his bow tie crooked. For the first time all evening, he looked less like a business magazine cover and more like a man who had just made a catastrophic mistake. His blue eyes were wide, almost desperate. "Explain what exactly?" Natalie's voice cracked with raw emotion. "That you saw me sitting alone and thought I would be grateful for whatever attention you decided to offer? That because I do not wear designer labels or move in your elite circles, I would jump at the chance to be your entertainment for an evening? No." Julian ran a hand through his hair, his composure completely shattered. "God, no. That is not what I meant at all." "Then what did you mean?" Natalie crossed her arms over her chest, creating a protective barrier against the hurt blooming in her ribcage. "Because from where I stand, it sounded exactly like you were trying to rent me for the night." The words hit their target perfectly. Julian flinched as if she had physically struck him, his face going even paler. "You are absolutely right," he said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "That is exactly how it sounded. And I am sorrier than you could possibly understand." Natalie studied his face carefully, searching for manipulation or practiced lies. Instead, she found something raw and genuine. Regret carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth, making him look older, more worn. "Real pain reflected in those blue depths that I do not understand you," she said, her voice softer now but still guarded. One minute you are talking about forever being impossible. The next you are asking me to be yours for a night. What am I supposed to think? Julian remained quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the marble floor between them. When he finally looked up, vulnerability made him almost unrecognizable from the confident man who had approached her table. I have never asked anyone for forever, he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him. Not once in 38 years. Because I have never believed I deserved it. The admission hung in the air between them like a fragile bridge, barely holding but somehow still standing. So you ask for one night instead? It is all I have ever thought I was worth. His voice dropped to barely audible. One night with someone beautiful and genuine and real. And then back to my empty penthouse and my empty life. At least that way, I cannot disappoint anyone when I inevitably fail them. Natalie felt her anger beginning to crack, revealing the hurt underneath. And what about me? What about what I might be worth? You are worth everything, Julian said without hesitation, his eyes meeting hers with startling intensity. That is exactly what terrifies me. The honesty in his voice nearly broke through her defenses completely. Natalie could feel herself softening despite every instinct screaming at her to run. This was dangerous territory, the kind of emotional quicksand that swallowed women whole and left them broken. I should leave, she whispered. But her feet remained planted. You should, Julian agreed. But he did not step away either. They stood there in the hotel lobby, two people from completely different worlds, surrounded by the soft murmur of conversations and distant music from the ballroom. Natalie could feel the pull between them, magnetic and undeniable. But she could also hear Helen's voice in her mind, gentle but firm. Love is not measured by beautiful words, child. It is measured by actions. My grandmother always told me, Natalie said slowly, that when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them the first time. Julian's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his temple. And what do you think I have shown you? Natalie looked at him, really looked at him, beyond the expensive suit and the reputation and the walls he had built around himself like fortress towers. What she saw was a man who had been taught to expect less because someone had convinced him he deserved less. A man who asked for one night because he had never learned to hope for more. I think, she said carefully, you have shown me someone who is deeply afraid. The words landed like arrows finding their mark. Julian's mask slipped completely, and for a moment, Natalie saw him as he truly was. Not the ruthless businessman or the untouchable mogul, but a man who had convinced himself that temporary was safer than forever because forever required vulnerability he had never been taught to offer. I should be terrified of you, she added quietly. Why are you not? Natalie considered the question, her heart hammering against her ribs. The smart answer was that she should be afraid. The safe answer was that she should run back to her small apartment and forget this night ever happened. But looking into Julian's eyes, seeing genuine regret mixed with something that looked like hope, she found herself giving a completely different answer. Because I do not think you really want just one night either. The lobby seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere nearby, elevator doors chimed. A couple walked past laughing, their happiness floating around them like perfume. But in their small bubble, everything had stopped. You do not know what you are talking about, Julian said, but his voice lacked any conviction. Do I not? Natalie stepped closer, searching his face with intensity that made him look away. Because the man who spent an hour talking about forever and daily devotion does not sound like someone who settles for temporary. Julian felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in armor he had worn so long he had forgotten what breathing without it felt like. The weight of years pressed down on his shoulders. Natalie. Her name came out rough, almost broken. Tell me I am wrong, she pressed, her voice soft but relentless. Tell me that when you were watching me from across that ballroom, you were thinking about one night. Tell me that is all you want. He opened his mouth to lie, to give her the easy answer that would send her running back to her safe, uncomplicated life where men like him did not exist to complicate things. But looking into her eyes, those deep knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense mechanism to his very soul, the words simply would not come that I cannot, he whispered. The admission seemed to echo through the entire lobby, louder than any music or conversation. Natalie's expression softened, and Julian saw something there that terrified him more than any hostile business takeover or financial crisis. Compassion mixed with understanding. Why? She asked gently, her voice carrying no judgment. Why can you not ask for what you really want? Julian turned away, unable to bear the kindness in her gaze. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline glittered like scattered jewels against black velvet. A view he had conquered, a city he had helped reshape, but it had never made him feel less alone. Because I have never been worth more than that, he said finally, the words tearing out of him. My father made absolutely certain I understood that from the time I was old enough to disappoint him. Natalie's sharp intake of breath made him look back at her. Pain filled her eyes, but not pity. Never pity. What do you mean? Theodore Westbrook did not believe in second chances, Julian said, bitter laughter escaping without humor. Coming in second meant you were the first loser. Good grades meant you were not trying hard enough. And emotions? He shook his head. Emotions were weaknesses that needed to be eliminated like mistakes in a business plan. Julian. Her voice was soft, but he heard the anger there. Not at him, but for him. I built my first property development at 25, he continued, words pouring out like water through a broken dam he could no longer contain. Made my first million at 27. Became a multi-millionaire before 30. And you know what my father said at my birthday dinner that year? He said that if I spent less time chasing women and more time working, I might actually build something that mattered. That is horrible. The thing is, Julian said, meeting her eyes again, I was not even dating anyone. I was working 80-hour weeks, barely sleeping, barely eating. But it was never enough. Nothing was ever enough to make him proud, to make him see me as anything more than a disappointment wearing an expensive suit. Natalie moved closer, and Julian realized tears were sliding down her cheeks. But she was not crying for herself. She was crying for him, for the boy who had grown up believing love had to be earned and was always just out of reach. That was not about you, she said firmly. That was about him and his own emptiness. Maybe. Julian's voice cracked. But it taught me something important. It taught me that I was better off not promising forever to anyone, because I would inevitably let them down. Better to keep things temporary, simple, without expectations I would fail to meet. So you have spent your entire adult life protecting people from yourself? Julian had never thought about it that way, but hearing her say it out loud made something click into place. Yes. I suppose I have. Natalie reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away. When he did not, she took his hand in both of hers. Her palms were warm and soft, her touch gentle. What if you are worth more than you think? She asked quietly. What if your father was wrong, and you have been punishing yourself for someone else's inability to love you the way you deserved? The words hit him like physical blows, each one landing with precision. Julian felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, years of protection dissolving under the warmth of her genuine care. I do not know how to be what you deserve, he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. I do not know how to be someone who stays, someone who keeps promises, someone who does not eventually destroy everything good in his life. Then maybe, Natalie said softly, you learn. One day at a time. One choice at a time. Just like my grandmother taught me about love. Julian looked at their joined hands, at the way her fingers intertwined with his as if they had always belonged there. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not hope exactly, but maybe the possibility of hope. I do not deserve your kindness. Probably not, Natalie agreed, and a small smile touched her lips. But maybe that is the point. Maybe love is not about deserving. Maybe it is about choosing to be brave enough to try anyway. The Chicago night wrapped around them like a velvet blanket as Julian and Natalie stepped out of the Crystal Plaza Hotel. The city hummed with life, taxi horns honking, distant laughter echoing from nearby restaurants, the smell of street vendor hot dogs mixing with expensive perfumes from passers-by. Natalie pulled her borrowed shawl tighter around her shoulders, the October air carrying a chill that made her shiver. Without a word, Julian shrugged off his tuxedo jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric still held his warmth, and Natalie found herself breathing in that subtle cologne that reminded her of winter forests and old libraries. She looked up at him, questions forming in her eyes. "Walk with me?" Julian asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had never heard from someone so powerful. "Just walk. No expectations. No promises. Just two people getting to know each other." Natalie nodded, and they began walking down Michigan Avenue, leaving the glittering hotel behind. The sidewalks were busy with Saturday night crowds, but somehow they found their own rhythm, navigating through the chaos side by side. "Tell me about your work," Julian said after a few moments of comfortable silence. "You mentioned an art gallery?" "I am a curator at the Riverside Gallery," Natalie explained, a small smile touching her lips. "We focus on emerging artists who cannot afford the big gallery representation fees. Most people have never heard of us, but we have helped launch 12 careers in the past 3 years." "That sounds incredibly meaningful." "It does not pay much," Natalie admitted, "but every time I see an artist's face when their first piece sells, or when someone truly connects with their work, I remember why I do it. Art has this power to make people feel less alone in the world. It tells them that someone else has felt what they feel, seen what they see, struggled with what they struggle with." Julian was quiet for a moment, processing her words. "I build structures," he said slowly. "Hotels, office buildings, apartment complexes. But I have never once thought about whether they make people feel less alone. I think about profit margins and return on investment and market positioning." "Buildings matter too," Natalie said gently. "People need places to live, places to work, places to create memories. You provide that." "But do I?" Julian stopped walking, turning to face her under a streetlight that cast golden shadows across his features. "Or do I just create expensive boxes that only certain people can afford? When was the last time I built something that actually helped someone who needed help?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Natalie could see him wrestling with thoughts he had probably never allowed himself to consider before. "It is never too late to change direction," she said softly. "My grandmother used to say that every single day is a chance to become someone different, someone better. The past teaches us, but it does not have to define us." "Your grandmother sounds like she was remarkable." "She was everything," Natalie said, emotion thickening her voice. "After my parents died, I was so angry at the world. I pushed everyone away, got into trouble at school, convinced myself that loving people only led to losing them. Helen never gave up on me. She showed me that closing your heart does not protect you from pain. It just guarantees you will miss out on joy." Julian reached out hesitantly, then took her hand. His palm was warm against hers, his grip gentle but firm. "I am sorry you lost your parents so young. I am sorry you lost your childhood to a father who could not see your worth." They stood there on the busy sidewalk, people flowing around them like water around stones, and something shifted between them. The walls were coming down, brick by brick, and neither of them seemed able to stop it. "Can I show you something?" Julian asked suddenly. Natalie nodded, curiosity replacing caution. Julian hailed a taxi, and within minutes they were pulling up in front of a construction site in a neighborhood Natalie recognized as one of the city's most struggling areas. Chain-link fences surrounded the property, and a large sign announced another Westbrook development project. This was supposed to be luxury condos, Julian said as they stood outside the fence, looking at the skeletal structure rising against the night sky. Top-dollar units that would have generated massive profits. But standing here now, talking to you, all I can think about is how this neighborhood needs affordable housing, not another building only the wealthy can access. So change it, Natalie said simply. It is not that easy. I have investors, contracts, expectations. You also have power and resources that most people never have access to, Natalie countered, turning to face him. You said your father taught you that nothing was ever enough. What if the real lesson should have been that enough is not about profit margins? What if enough means using what you have to make a real difference? Julian stared at the construction site, his expression thoughtful. What would you do? If this were your project, Natalie considered the question seriously. I would build mixed-income housing. Some market-rate units to cover costs, but also affordable apartments for families who work in this city but cannot afford to live here anymore. I would include community spaces where people could gather, build relationships, support each other. Maybe partner with local artists to create murals and installations that give the neighborhood beauty and identity. That would cut profits by more than half. But it would change lives. Natalie stepped closer to him. You asked me earlier if I believed in forever, in daily devotion, in promises that last. I do believe in those things. But I also believe that the way we live our lives every day says more about who we are than any single grand gesture. You could make this building into something that actually helps people. That would say something about who you choose to be. Julian turned to look at her, and in the dim light from distant street lamps, his eyes reflected something new. Not just attraction or curiosity, but genuine transformation. You make it sound so simple. The decision is simple, Natalie said. The execution is hard. But most worthwhile things are. They stood in silence, the night air cool against their skin. Finally, Julian pulled out his phone and made a call. Natalie could hear only his side of the conversation, but she heard enough. Robert, it is Julian. I know it is late. I need you to schedule an emergency meeting with all investors on the Monroe Street project. Monday morning. We are changing direction completely. I will explain then, but I need your trust on this. Yes, I understand the implications. Do it anyway. When he ended the call, he looked at Natalie with an expression that mixed terror and exhilaration. I just potentially destroyed months of work and millions in projected profits. Or you just started building something that actually matters. Julian laughed, the sound genuine and free. How do you do that? How do you make terrifying decisions sound like obvious choices? Because I believe in you, Natalie said simply. I see who you could be, not just who you have been taught to be. They walked for hours after that, talking about everything and nothing. Julian told her about growing up in boarding schools, about holidays spent alone because his father was always traveling, about building his business from the ground up partly to prove his worth and partly to create the stability he had never known. Natalie shared stories about Helen's garden, about teenagers at the community center where she volunteered, about her dreams of opening a gallery specifically for artists who had experienced trauma and loss. As dawn began painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they found themselves at the lakefront. The water stretched endlessly before them, waves lapping gently against the shore. Joggers passed by, and early morning fishermen set up their gear, but Julian and Natalie sat on a bench, watching the sunrise together. This was supposed to be one night, Julian said quietly. It still is, Natalie replied. One night that happens to be ending. But it does not feel like an ending. No. It feels like a beginning. Julian turned to her, his blue eyes serious. I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to be someone who stays, who builds something real with another person. I will probably mess this up in spectacular ways. Probably, Natalie agreed, and they both smiled. But here is what I learned from watching my grandparents, from losing people I loved, from all the mistakes I have made. Love is not about being perfect. It is about showing up. It is about choosing each other even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. What if I choose wrong? What if I hurt you? You probably will sometimes, Natalie said honestly. And I will probably hurt you sometimes too. That is what happens when imperfect people try to build something together. But the question is not whether we will make mistakes. The question is whether we will be brave enough to try anyway. Julian reached for her hand again, and this time there was no hesitation. I want to try. I am terrified, and I have no idea what I am doing, but I want to try. Then that is enough for today, Natalie said, squeezing his hand. Tomorrow you can choose again. And the day after that. One day at a time. They watched the sun climb higher, painting the world in golden light. Around them, the city was waking up, starting a new day full of possibilities. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Julian felt something unfamiliar blooming in his chest. Not just hope, but genuine belief that maybe, just maybe, he was worth the kind of love that lasted. As they stood to leave, Julian pulled Natalie close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. She melted into him, feeling safe and seen and valued in ways she had never experienced before. Thank you, he whispered against her hair. For what? For seeing me. The real me. Not the business mogul or the money or the reputation. Just me. Thank you for letting me, Natalie replied. They left the lakefront together, hand in hand, walking into whatever came next. Neither knew what the future held. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, times when old patterns threatened to resurface. But they had made a choice, not just for one night, but for the possibility of something more. Because that is what love really is. Not a single grand gesture or a perfect moment frozen in time. Love is the daily choice to show up, to be vulnerable, to keep trying even when it is scary. Love is seeing someone's flaws and choosing them anyway. Love is believing that broken people can heal together, that past pain does not have to dictate future joy, that it is never too late to become who you were always meant to be. Julian and Natalie's story was just beginning, but they had already learned the most important lesson. That true love requires courage. The courage to be honest about your fears. The courage to believe you are worthy of being chosen. The courage to choose someone else even when you are terrified of losing them. And the courage to believe that every single day is a new opportunity to love better, deeper, and more authentically than the day before. As they disappeared into the morning crowd, two lives forever changed by one night, they carried with them a truth that would sustain them through whatever came next. That we are all works in progress, all learning, all growing. And that the greatest gift we can give or receive is the permission to be imperfect while still being loved. The wedding crasher and the billionaire had found something neither expected. Not just romance, but redemption. Not just attraction, but authentic connection. And most importantly, they had found the courage to believe that they both deserved the very thing they had spent years convincing themselves was impossible. Forever, it turned out, was not a destination. It was a journey taken one courageous step at a time.